Alrighty, in this section we are going to be talking about Webpack. So in the first module loader we looked at, it was require.js, pretty straightforward. It just is responsible for grabbing files through the web browser as they're required and as they're defined, and super awesome and all that great stuff. But it did have some limitations, and we talked about that in the last video. So then we took a look at Browserify, which was awesome in that it allowed us, it understood the file system and made resolving our modules so much simpler. We could use npm as a package manager. Well, Browserify is very simple, very straightforward, very easy to use, and there's a lot of great reasons to use it. I like it a lot. But Webpack is similar to Browserify. It works in the same way as Browserify, but I think that this is going to be something that's more feature complete and has quite a few additional loaders and additional ways to work with it that I think for larger projects you might want to actually consider this. So Webpack is, to sum it up, I can actually show you guys a diagram that's right on the front page. Basically, it takes all your dependencies, you put it through Webpack, and then you get your artifacts, just like Browserify. But it's a very configuration-based system, and it has a bunch of modules, a bunch of plugins that we can use to load all sorts of things. Everything from your HTML files to your CSS files to your image files and all that fun stuff. Now, Browserify does that. Browserify has loaders for a lot of different types of modules that you might want to load, but the Webpack was kind of built more in terms of handling these sort of situations or more complex situations out of the box. Like, for example, as you saw in the last video, or a couple videos ago, when we imported that CSS, we had some issues with, having to write code to translate the paths and all that stuff. Webpack I consider it to be more fully featured. But on the other hand, it's also a lot more complex. See, Browserify didn't have much configuration. It didn't really need it. It's a very straightforward, awesome tool. Require.js required a bunch of configuration because you needed to instruct the browser how to load our modules. Webpack is kind of like Require.js in the fact that it requires a lot of configuration, but like Browserify in the fact that it is a lot more powerful and understands the file system and provides us this build step. And it provides us so many things out of the box and so many well-maintained plugins that, again, I hope that people really consider this. The goal of this section is not to go over every single thing you can do with Webpack. I've said this about everything we've covered in this series, and it holds true more for Webpack than it does anything else. In fact, if we hop over here to its page on the configuration, we see we have this huge document about all the different ways that we can configure it. And I recommend looking at this documentation, this config documentation, but once you kind of get a feel for how Webpack is designed to work. So in this video, I just kind of want to get an overview of how we can work with Webpack and some of the configuration options we're going to be dealing with, and how we can use some certain loaders to do some fun stuff. So I think we'll be pulling in some shim loaders as well as a less loader, just to give you guys a feel of how to work with loaders. Loaders are a very, very important topic with Webpack, and getting familiar with them is really, really important. Anyway, I guess that means let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to come over here into our Webpack intro folder, and I'm going to go ahead and install it. I'm going to go npm install Webpack. Again, I really, 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 really do not recommend that you install these packages globally. I really recommend that we install them locally, and then we use either a Gulp file or an npm script in order to work with it. Installing modules globally is a very bad thing to do. Okay, so we see that it has a whole lot of dependencies here. So how do we use it? Well, we primarily are going to, there's two ways, just like Browserify. We can use the CLI, or we can use a Gulp file and actually bring it into a Node environment. And obviously the second way is a lot more flexible, but let's go ahead and take a look at the CLI real fast. So the CLI is going to be, as usual, in node modules.bin webpack, and if we run it, we'll see a bunch of options. Now, the thing about the CLI, the Webpack CLI, is I do not recommend using it to specify your configuration. You can use the Webpack CLI, but I really, 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 really encourage that you write a Webpack configuration file, which is going to be a node module. And we'll take a look at what that looks like here in a moment. But the reason is yeah, you can specify a bunch of these parameters and can get away without providing a config file. But with the amount of configuration options you're going to be working with in the average Webpack project, I'm not even going to cover that aspect to it. Just create a configuration file is all I'm going to say. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and launch code here. And I guess before we do that, let's just create a really standard folder structure. So I'm going to create our public folder just like usual. We'll have our HTTP server running in that. We can do our source, and we can go ahead and put in our scripts and our styles. And in scripts, we might have an application.js entry point, or maybe let's just do an index.js file. And here I'll just say console log hey for our index.js. And then in public, we can go ahead and create an index.html file. And let's just go ahead and throw some stuff in here. Doc type HTML, and then we'll do our standard HTML head plus body. And then in here, we'll go ahead and include a script. So I'm going to say script source is, let's just do like something like build / and in this example, we'll change this here in a moment when we talk about creating multiple bundles from the same project. For here, we'll just do app.js. So we have that. Then let's hop over here before I forget and start another CMD window or another terminal, depending on your operating system. CD into public, and then do our HTTP server. So now we have that listening on port 8080. Okay, so our goal now is to have a folder called build, where we're going to have Webpack compile our index.js and stuff it in this folder. So what we need to do is we need to create a Webpack configuration file. Now, Webpack configuration file is a Node module. So I'm going to go ahead and say here, and I'm going to call this specifically webpack.config.js. And it's going to be here at the root of my project. It might not look like it's at the root of the project because we don't have icons here in our Solution Explorer, but it is, and that's important. Webpack.config is a special name that's going to be picked up by default with Webpack, kind of like a Gulp file. So when we execute our Webpack command from this directory, it's going to pick up on this config file for us. Now, we can specify other Webpack configuration files. We can have multiple Webpack config files. Maybe you'll have one for production, one for development. Maybe you'll have a Webpack config for your server versus your client if you choose to run your server code through Webpack as well, which is an acceptable thing to do. But anyway, the point is we have a Webpack config.js. And all we're going to do here with our Webpack config is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, first of all, import path. We're going to need path. And then I'm simply going to say module.exports equals object. And that's our config file. Now, the cool thing about Webpack config files, just like Gulp files, is they are Node modules. We can execute arbitrary JavaScript in here. And I find that to be very, very useful because it allows us because the Webpack configuration can get pretty long sometimes, and by allowing us to write JavaScript code inside of our config file, it makes doing things that we might have to loop over or other repetitious tasks a lot easier. But anyway, for our exports, I'm simply going to say entry is source scripts index.js, and then I'm going to say output, and for output I'm going to say path is going to be path.join __ dir name public build, and then our file name will be app.js. All right. So the output, the entry is going to be an array, a string, or an object. And we'll talk about what those different things mean later, but now we're just having one entry point. Think of the entry as the script that's going to be loaded onto the page when you load that page. I mean, it is the entry point to the application, just like Browserify had an entry point. Require.js did not have an entry point, but it kind of did because that was the first module we loaded. The output object is, not surprisingly, telling Webpack about how to print out our modules. So in this case, we're giving it a path of our public build. And this is going to be an absolute path. So we're using path.join to create an absolute path. And we're using __ dir name, which is a special variable given to us by common.js. Well, specifically here, the node runtime, that gives us the absolute path to the current directory of this module. And then we have file name, which should be self-explanatory. The file name is the output file name. Okay, let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. I'm going to move this off the side here. And I'm simply going to type in node modules.bin webpack and hit enter. And so notice, like Gulp, I just have to say Webpack and hit enter, and it'll pick up on that default file name. But look at the output here. So we have asset is app.js. We get size, how many chunks it has. We get a thing right here saying that it was emitted and that its chunk name is main. And then we get a location for that file, that where it was printed out, or where it came from, rather, not where it was printed out. But now we can come over here to public, and we see build now has app.js. If I open up app.js, you will see a Webpack module, or rather a Webpack bundle. So Webpack bundle always has this awesome little header up here, and then it will list all of the modules here in a comma-separated list of their names, of their IDs. So in this case, this is an array of all the modules, and this is module 0. And we see we're loading it. We're just saying console log hey. So now I can come back to my browser, and I can bring it over here, hit refresh, open up my DevTools, and I do indeed see that hey has been printed out to the console. So yeah, Webpack is working. Now another great, awesome thing about Webpack that we'll be taking advantage of a lot is the watch parameter. So the watch parameter is basically, if you just do Webpack-W, we're now in watch mode. So again, so unlike when we have where we're using Gulp plus require.js, or we were using Watchify, Webpack has this all built in, and you don't have to worry about whether or not you're building once or you're watching. And Webpack will intelligently handle all of the internal caching mechanisms for itself. So it's a very efficient way to do watching. So if I split this window here, come back into my index.js and say, hey, 1, 2, 3, and hit save, notice how it almost immediately appears over here. And we can see the output right here as well. We can see it took 14 milliseconds, and we can see that the main chunk was emitted. So really, this is just the simple use case of using Webpack. So let's talk about loading in other modules. In scripts, I'm going to create another file. Let's call this amd.js. And let's actually create another script here, and let's call this lib.js. Lib.js, I'll just say export func1 equals, and I'm not going to use ES 2015 syntax here. That's important. We'll need an additional transpiler step in order to do that. So by export, I meant exports. And this will just say console log func1. And then over here in amd.js, I'll go ahead and write a basic AMD module. I'll say define. I'm going to import lib as my module, and then I'm going to say function lib, and then I'll say lib.func1, and I'll just run that. And then, yeah. So now let's go ahead and jump into our index.js, and let's say var AMD equals require AMD. And of course, the way that Webpack is going to work is it's going to expect us to kind of work like Node, where when we want to do a relative module, we have to add the /. But anyway, so now we've loaded in AMD, and if I did, if I just went ahead and refreshed my browser over here, hit refresh, we see func1 being invoked, and then hey 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a quick look at what I did here, because what I did here is actually one of the coolest things about Webpack itself. Index.js is a straightforward common JS module. We're just using the require function. However, AMD is an AMD module. We're using the AMD format. We're using the define method or function that imports this particular library and then has this execution. And then we have lib, which is a common JS module. So we have a common JS module importing an AMD module, importing another common JS module. So that's really important to understand, is Webpack is very, very permissive about the different styles of modules that you might have. So you'll notice down here, Webpack detected that this was a AMD module and automatically gave us a wrapper around it. So that's a really important thing to understand about Webpack. It's actually going to read the contents of the file, determine what module format it's in, and then load it. So it doesn't really care if you're using AMD or CommonJS or whatever, as long as it can appropriately detect which one it's using. But of course, that's very simple because in the example of AMD, it's going to look for this define function call at the top. So that's really the basics of Webpack. I mean, like I said earlier, it's very configuration oriented, and right now we're just loading in modules. So there's not a whole lot to talk about in regards to loading in modules. It'll do the right thing. It'll figure it out. So far, we basically just replicated Browserify, but without Babel. So I think in the next video, we're going to take a look at how we can use loaders to load in different module formats. Because again, when we talk about modules in Webpack, we're not talking about JavaScript, just JavaScript files. We're talking about TypeScript files, Coffee files, we're talking about CSS files, we're talking about images and files and all that fun stuff. So I think in the next video, we'll take a look at the two different ways that we can use what are called loaders to load in different formats of modules. And we'll see you guys